Is this on? Can you hear me? Yes. So they told me this is sunny California. Right. Since the end of the civil rights period in the 70s, the nation has claimed that race is declining in significance. That Americans of all hues face a society where people are basically judged by their merits and skills. But this belief faces a clear obstacle. That 40 plus years after the Kerner Commission report stated, and I quote, that our nation is moving toward two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal, race still divides the nation in a profound way, and rather than two nations, we may have like 4 or maybe 5 nations. Data on income, wealth, housing, and educational and occupational inequality shows huge racial disparities. So how can this be the case? Didn't racism end in the 1960s? To address this perplexing fact, the existence of tremendous level of racial inequality, when so many people believe that we are beyond race, I will do 4 things. Oh, that's my agenda, it's there, okay. First, define what is racism and argue that we need to conceptualize the phenomenon in a structural or systematic way. Second, argue that the collapse of Jim Crow in the late 1960s did not mean the end of systemic racism, but instead led to the emergence of a new race regime I label in my work the new racism. Third, I will identify the new prejudice or the new racial ideology in play that orchestrates or organizes white racial views, which I call colorblind racism. And lastly, I will make some observations about how this new racial landscape works in the academy and affects people of color, and by extension, affects our representation in STEM fields. So please fasten your intellectual seatbelts, as my time is very short, hence I must go like in the movie, fast and furious. Okay, first point. We know race matters in all sorts of social affairs, yet when we try to talk about race matters with whites, most roll their eyes and tell us, here you go again. Or, come on, man, stop playing the race card. But there is a cure for whites' delusion. The cure requires me to talk theory, and theory, like most medicine, tastes bad. So bear with me, please. The problem, as I see it, is that we are allowing whites to define racism in a very narrow way. For whites, racism is the KKK, neo-Nazis, people in the South, and lately, the birders and their Tea Party cousins. Therefore, the folk definition of racism is the irrational beliefs some people have about the presumed inferiority of others. That's the common sense way we all think racism is all about. But this view does not allow us to see racism as a systemic national problem and forces us to think about racism as a matter of good versus bad people, or the racist versus non-racist. So I will make a more problematic statement, and I will argue that racism should be conceptualized first and foremost as systemic, societal, or structural. Racism is as American as apple pie. Racism during slavery and Jim Crow was not about some bad people, but about a society partially organized around race. And once the logic and practice of race became part of our nation, all members of the polity have participated of systemic racism, some as beneficiaries and some as its victims. Therefore, racism exists today not as a remnant from the past, yeah? or as the behavioral expression of prejudiced people, yeah? Instead, racism remains in place because it benefits whites as a social collectivity. Not whites in the audience. All of you are beyond race. You're good folks. You're fighting for racial justice, yeah? So the second problem with conceiving racism as a psychological quirk or as the overt behavior of some individuals is that we miss most of the racial affairs happening before our own eyes. As I will argue soon, nowadays, the majority of racial events and behaviors, let's call them racial practices, are subtle, institutionalized, and apparently non-racial. Therefore, by focusing our attention on overt racial events for moral judgment and political action, we, one, legitimate an erratic conceptualization of racism. Second, cloud efforts to bring to the fore discussions about how race matters in the everyday life, yeah? And lastly, we help sustain the notion of America the beautiful. That is, a nation that is beyond race. And now with the black president, it's like, yeehaw, we are beyond. My second point. We also seem to be in a corner when talking about racism, as we can no longer say we face routinely the practices associated with slavery. Slavery is over, and Jim Crow is mostly over. Some parts of the nation are still like, hello, did we have a civil rights movement? Yes, we did. So because we don't have those practices, white folks tell us things like, come on, folks, slavery and Jim Crow are long gone, so if you are not doing well today, it is your own darn fault. We all have heard that kind of argument, yeah? But there is an answer for this silliness, too. We must state vigorously that the end of Jim Crow did not imply the end of systemic racism. Instead, racial domination was reorganized into a new regime I label as the new racism. By this I mean the subtle and apparently beyond race character of most public racial practices. And there is a beautiful book. I have a son, and he's like, Papi, can you float me $1,000? I'm like, $1,000, man, you crazy. For parents in the room, particularly young parents, my son is 29. And he's still asking for money, so it never ends. So let me give you a few specific examples of new racism practices. Because the practice associated with residential segregation in the Jim Crow period, housing covenants, racial terrorism such as burning crosses in your house, etc., became illegal, and the normative climate of what can be said and done has changed, one would expect residential segregation to have declined significantly. However, the data shows that we are almost as residentially segregated as we were 30, 40 years ago. So why is this the case? Residential segregation remains today because discrimination in the housing and lending markets still takes place. Report after report document how little we have improved in this area and how new racism practices are behind our current levels of residential apartheid. Not my term, the term of a book titled American Apartheid by Douglas Massey and Nancy Denton. For example, the authors of a recent report issued by the Civil Rights Project at Harvard titled More Than Money noted that, and I quote, affordability alone cannot explain the existing pattern of segregation. That is, it's not just money, yeah? And added, the main reasons for continued segregation include steering by realtors. This is realtors showing certain neighborhoods to certain people, yeah? Subprime loans, the 2008 crisis showed that those bad loans were disproportionately given to people of color. And lack of action by the area, cities, and towns. So if a city doesn't deal with residential segregation matters, is that racist? Well, in the course of law, I think it is, you're right. But in the course of law, you cannot just say, well, the city ain't doing jack about race matters. I'm like, that's not the prima facie a case of discrimination, yeah? The 2006 report by the Fair Housing Center of Greater Boston indicated that their testers experienced discrimination 45% of the cases, and blacks 50%. You know how they do this, yeah? They match people. To document discrimination, they match testers and send them to the market to try to rent apartments or show interest in houses. And then they compare notes. 50% of the blacks experience discrimination, 45% of the testers experience. The interesting part is that often the minority testers, they also have white testers to compare notes, yeah? Don't know they have experienced discrimination, okay? Because you can go and they tell you, geez, we don't have apartments now, but we're looking for people just like you. And then the white fellow comes and he's like, oh, we have 4 apartments. Which one you want, yeah? Okay. All in all, whites were 5 to 6 times more likely to be told about available units than minority applicants. 5 to 6 times, yeah? The report told of one black tester who was advised that the apartments she had seen were not available until January 1st, while the white tester was told available December 1st. Advantage white, 1 month. In another case, a Latino tester and a white tester both emailed an agent and left voice messages. The white tester received an email with a picture of the available units. The Latino tester is still waiting for an answer. Is that discrimination? I agree, but try to win in court a case of discrimination unless you have the white fellow documenting that, while you got that, I got this. And most of us don't have, you have to have white friends so you can compare notes. And like, hey, I need to go shopping, I'm going to buy a car, come with me, okay. So these kind of practices have been documented in all sorts of venues. But the trick is that it's hard to call them racial, yeah? Let me give you one example for my personal life. Let me get off the tricky, because I'm supposed to be counting time, but I don't care. So I'm a professor at Duke, but I navigate life as a black-looking person with a beautiful Puerto Rican accent, despite the fact that I was born in Pennsylvania. Can you detect my Pennsylvania accent? So, like most black-looking people and dark-skinned folks, when I go to many stores, particularly fancy stores, I get the, may I help you? Just looking. A minute later, may I help you? Just looking. May I help you? I'm like, wait a second. So now I go by the rule of 2. The first time, very politely, I'm like, just looking. The second time, may I help you? I'm like, yes. I'm trying to steal this fancy coat. And I was wondering if you could give me some ideas about how to accomplish this task. If discrimination is not part of the transaction, the response from the person should be like, huh? When I have done it, it's like, I am here like that. I'm like, yes, you did. That's why your reaction was the way it was. So I travel across the nation, and then invariably, a white student, young person comes and says, I work in a store. We don't do that, but we do this. We follow, we do all, and we follow in a clever way, yeah? So you follow, and you are like there, and they are like, Is that discrimination? Your answer is yes. Good luck proving that in court. Okay. Third point. Alongside the new racism regime, a more suave, strategic type of race ideology emerged. I call it colorblind racism. It is imperative, I think, that we understand the nature of this new beast, as the crass, direct Jim Crow race prejudice and language of the past are no longer our primary ideological enemies. It's not that we don't have the old language and names out there. It's that in combat, it's not likely to be the weapons of choice used to fight us. Albeit, occasionally, we people of color have to contend with fools who say some racist, straight racist stuff, yeah. Our enemy nowadays is more refined and therefore much more dangerous. I have labeled this new kind of prejudice colorblind racism, and contend it has all but replaced the nasty race discourse of yesteryears. By colorblind racism, I mean the dominant race ideology anchored on the abstract extension of the principles of liberalism to race matters, which furnishes apparently non-racial explanations for all sorts of race-related matters. That sounds complex. I'll give you examples. In my book, okay, that is not subliminal. Black and Puerto Rican ain't got time to be subliminal. So in my book, I deconstruct each component part of this ideology and explain how to battle against each element of this ruling dogma. But here, I will just give you one example of the frames, one of the style, and one of the racial storylines of this ideology. For more, you know what you have to do. The central frames of this ideology are abstract liberalism, naturalization, cultural racism, and minimization of racism. I'll give you one example of abstract liberalism. This frame incorporates tenets associated with classical liberalism in an abstract and decontextualized manner. By framing race-related matters in the language of liberalism, whites can appear reasonable, even moral, while opposing all practical approaches to deal with race inequality. I missed one page. So let me give you the example of Jim, who is a 30-year-old computer software salesperson from a privileged background. And he explained his opposition to affirmative action as follows. Here, I'm not too concerned with his position on affirmative action. I'm concerned with how he explained his opposition. So he said, I think it's unfair top to bottom on everybody, and the whole process, often, discrimination itself is a bad word, right? But you discriminate every day. You want to buy a beer at the store, and there are 6 kinds of beers. You can get from Natural Light to Sam Adams, right? And you look at the price, and you look at the kind of beer, and it's a choice. And a lot of what you have laid out in front of you, which one you get? Now, should the government sponsor Sam Adams and make it cheaper than Natural Light because it's brewed by someone in Boston? That doesn't make much sense, right? Why would we want that or make Sam Adams 8 times as expensive because we want people to buy Natural Light? I use this quote on purpose because for half the audience, the issue is like, so? That's what I'm here, to tell you what is problematic with this statement. So Jim assumes hiring decisions are like market choices, choosing between competing brands of beer. So therefore, he embraces a laissez-faire position on hiring, hire the best qualified. The problem with Jim's view, which is a view shared by most whites, is that labor market discrimination is alive and well and affects anywhere between 35%, the payers are stuck, 30 to 50% of the job applicants, according to reports from the Urban League, HUD, etc. More significantly, the work of Deva Payer at Princeton shows you don't even need to, one person knows that, okay, so you took a sociology course, huh? Okay, so Deva Payer shows that she created this experiment. Let me send resumes, yeah, to employers. And it's the same resume, except that in one is Jim White, and the second one is Tyrone, okay? And guess what she found? Tyrone ain't getting no job. Then she decided, let me go further. What if I say that Jim White also has a criminal record and Tyrone doesn't have a criminal record? And guess what was the finding? Advantage White by like 15%. So you don't even need to show up to experience discrimination. Secondly, although Jim believes that, as do most whites, that jobs in America are awarded in meritocratic fashion, that is, the person with the most qualifications who gets the job, which after having George Bush as our president for 8 years, should be like not happen, you know. Researchers have documented that most jobs, as many as 80 to 85%, are obtained through informal networks. And this finding applies to good as well as to bad jobs. Okay? This is not just the elite jobs, but also jobs in the technical fields, etc. Therefore, by upholding this strict laissez-faire position, Jim is defending the racial status quo in a nice way. Yeah? Let me talk about the second part of style. Yeah? Ideologies are not just about ideas, but about what kind of strategies we use to express the ideas. Yeah? And we need these rhetorical devices to weave arguments in a moment in which you got to be careful, yeah, with what you say. I define the style of the ideology as the peculiar linguistic manners and rhetorical strategies of race talk. That is, the technical tools that allow users to articulate its frames and racial stories. And I don't want to give you, in the book, there is a full discursive theoretical part, but I didn't come here to talk theory. I wanted to convince you about arguments and engage in the debate. So there are 5 components, and I will give you an example of one of them, of semantic moves. Semantic moves are phrases that protect users' moral standpoint, such as, I am not a racist, but, and after the but, they go wild. Some of my best friends are black. I don't know their name, but I know they're some of my best friends, yeah? So these are disclaimers which allow folks to say stuff and then always have the safety of being able to say, but I told you I'm not a racist, so although I said all this stuff, I didn't mean it because I proclaim I'm not a racist, yeah? However, these moves have become so passé that most of us, particularly young folks, are like, come on, you cannot say that. So ideologies are always unfinished products. So new things emerge, such as, I voted for Obama, so I'm like, so what, man, so what, yeah? But that's becoming a new way of sort of safety, yeah? Like, I voted for Obama, so I got my free of racism card, so I can do and say whatever I want, yeah? Or one that I found in the data is a move that I call the yes and no move. And the example is Sandra, a person that I cited somewhere, yeah? And the question she answered was, are you for or against affirmative action? Again, I'm not concerned now with the position of affirmative action, but what kind of stylistic component she used to be able to express her view and have the safety of yes and no. Okay, so here is the quote, yes and no. So here you have the creativity of the sociologist in naming semantic moves. I got it straight from her, yes and no. I feel someone should be able to have something, education, job, whatever, because they have earned it, they deserve it. They have the ability to do it. You don't want to put a 6-year-old as a rocket scientist. They don't have the ability. It doesn't matter if the kid's black or white. As far as letting one have the job over another one, just because of the race or the gender, I don't believe in that. So here you have the move, yeah? Her position on affirmative action is yes and no, but if you reread here, the no is quite strong, and I fail to see much of the yes. But if she were in a rhetorical battle with you, and you are like, that's racist, I'm like, no, I told you, I'm conflicted. Well, actually, you're not conflicted. We heard you, you know. The last component of colorblind racism is racial stories. In the book, I examine 2 kinds of racial stories. First are storylines, which are socially shared tales that are fable-like and incorporate a common schemata and wording. So when I give you the examples, you'll be like, oh yeah, I have heard that. And they're fable-like because the characters in the stories sort of impersonal genetic, and it has little narrative content. Second are testimonies, which are accounts where the narrator is a central participant in the story or is close to the characters in the story. The major storylines of colorblind racism are the past is the past. Have you heard that one? I didn't own any slaves. If Jews, Italians, and Irish have made it, How come blacks and Puerto Ricans particularly have not? And lastly, I did not get a job or was admitted to Harvey Mudd College because of a minority. That was a joke. It's bad when I have to say, hey, laugh. I will assume all of you are familiar with these stories, and accordingly, we'll just provide one example of a testimony, okay? In the book, I discuss three types of testimonies. You have them there. And I want to talk about this case where the respondent used a story of interaction with blacks, in this case, a negative story to express his views. So the person is Bill, a retired school teacher who explained why he thinks blacks and whites are different. After pointing out that blacks, quote, seem to be very religious and that they bought a church in his neighborhood, he claimed they forced a restaurant out of business and explained the situation as follows. They like to eat. They pile their dishes just loaded with that stuff. And I actually didn't see it, but I saw one lady come in with a full plate of chicken. I didn't pay much attention. The next thing I know, they are leaving. Now, I know she didn't eat all that chicken. She probably put it in her purse and walked out of it. A lot of them are doing that. How can they make any money? And since that they're all heavy people, it seems like they do a lot of eating. So I don't know what to say about something like that. Okay, so Bill is an older person transitioning from the Jim Crow, not successfully, transitioning from the Jim Crow perspective to the colorblind narrative, but he's not doing a good job. But the interesting thing is that he, like most characters, used his testimonies to vent animosity and express his belief that blacks like to eat, are cheap, and steal. Okay, now the last and probably most important point. We signal the racial character of HBCUs by calling them HBCUs. We believe these colleges are all black. It's not true, but that's the belief, yeah? And some even believe these institutions have lost their reason to exist. We can have a debate about whether or not we should keep them. I think that there are some empirical reasons why we may want to keep them. Historically black colleges and universities, HBCUs. Accordingly, we recognize HBCUs in racial terms, albeit in a distorted way. But we never think about the whiteness of the places we labor. We seldom think about the history and practice that created and maintained these institutions as white, or, as the case of Harvey Mudd, as mostly white. Instead, we conceive these places in universalistic terms, as just colleges and universities. However, these colleges, which I label HWCUs, historically white colleges and universities, have a history, a demography, a curriculum, a climate, and symbols and traditions that embody, signify, and reproduce whiteness and systemic racism. This organizational reality produces the so-called isolated incidents that keep happening again and again and again in HWCUs all over the nation, such as in 2012, sorority dressed up in Mexican costumes at Penn State. I was born in Penn State, with signs that read, oh, that's Duke. The sign read, "We'll mow lawn for weed and beer, and I don't cut grass, I smoke it." Ha ha ha, don't laugh. And this year at Duke, members of a fraternity did a racist anti-Asian theme party. The initial invitation for the party, Asia Prime Party, began by mimicking stereotypical accented Asian speech and closed with, "We look forward to having me, you, and your friends over for some sake, thank you," etc. And again, the university, they had developed you can predict, incident happens, the university will apologize, oh, it's amazing, these silly students, it's an isolated case, the students involved will be told, you need to apologize, and then they go on an apology tour. I didn't mean it, you know me. Some of my best friends are black. I'm so sorry, it never happened again. And then a year later, again and again and again. So as social analysts and scientists, we know that there are patterns, yeah? So when things keep happening again and again and again, logic dictates this cannot be just isolated incidents. We have to analyze what is the context that may be producing and reproducing these events again and again and again. Therefore, we must come to terms with the whiteness of the places we work or study, as this social fact is responsible for the racial climate, racial incidence, and lack of diversity in these white universities. We must recognize that universities such as Duke, where I labor, Harvard, or Harvey Mudd were established as all white or almost all white, and they remained so until the 1970s. Therefore, a central constitutive component of HBCUs is their historical white demography. On this point, a black student, after having visited an Ivy League college, described in Fagan's book, The Agony of Education, as follows. One reason I didn't go there was because it reeked of whiteness, and that is no joke, and I'm not exaggerating. I was only there for 2 days, and after 1 day, I wanted to leave. And I mean, really, it just reeked everywhere I went, reeked of all white men, just lily whiteness, oozing from the corners. I wanted to leave, and I knew that socially, I would just be miserable. And I talked to other black students. I talked to all of them because they aren't a lot. And so I said, do you like it here? And they were like, no, we're miserable. You know where that picture comes from? It's from here. So you found the only black student. Anyway. Across the nation, this is also a part of the diversity dilemma. So they always, in Wisconsin, my alma mater, what they did was they superimposed a black person in the webpage, and it's like, hey, and the fellow, to his credit, he saw the thing. I wasn't there. What are you talking about? So he created a big scandal, and they had to apologize. We didn't mean it, but we really are a diverse community. I'm like, really? Let's look at the data. Okay. HBCUs such as Harvey Mudd, with 7% Latino, 1% Black in the student body, do not represent targeted minority populations at the national rate, and the faculty is even whiter. And to avoid the nonsense I hear all the time in HBCUs, I remind you that yours is a national college, hence, you must strive to represent not the local, but the racial demography of the nation. So don't tell me, we don't have blacks in, what's the name of this town? Claremont. With 3 blacks, Joe, Tyrone, So what do you expect, Another component of HBCUs is a curriculum that reflects the norms, values, history, and position of whites in the world. I know this statement is controversial, as many assume knowledge is not racialized or gendered, but is pure and universal. Please see my white logic and white method on that. Last commercial, I promise. However, I am sure few of you do not doubt that what passed as history, as the classics, as philosophy, and as sociology in HBCUs until the 1960s was absolutely biased towards whites, the West and Europe. Probably most of you would agree with the great black historian, Carter G. Woodson, who stated the following in his The Miseducation of the Negro. We're talking about that this morning. Yeah? Much of what universities have taught as economics, history, literature, religion, and philosophy is propaganda. When a Negro had finished his education in our schools, then he has been equipped to begin the life of an Americanized or Europeanized white man. The present system, under the control of whites, trains the Negro to be white and at the same time convinces him of the impropriety or the impossibility of his becoming white. My call here is for educators to always consider the possibility that they may need to be educated themselves, and from time to time, by their own students. Paulo Freire, the great educator, suggested that we have to have this dialectic between the educator and the educated. Hence, I'm not in the business of bearing the work of dead white guys, the controversy in the 80s and 90s. I am for the canons to be opened to alternative interpretations, and in a science college, that should be the criteria. Open up. You don't know where the new discovery will come from, yeah? I am for the canons to be discussed as anything should be in a true university. On this, I agree with the biologist, Sandra Harding, who states in her Science and Social Inequality that, like in ecological systems, and I cite her, the cognitive diversity generated by culturally local knowledge projects is a great resource for our species. So having variety of perspectives help us, yeah? Think about in the field of medicine. For the longest time, it's like, oh, those Chinese people doing acupuncture. And now, NIH is giving grants to people to examine if acupuncture may be a better way of dealing with pain than what I have been popping all day, aspirins, yeah? Which now we know aspirins have all kinds of negative effects in the body. So maybe it's better for me to do acupuncture. But it's not covered in my HMO, so no acupuncture for me. Lastly, HBCUs engender a white ecology or culture. And Fagan suggests that the most damaging component of discrimination in higher education is, and I quote, the taking for granted by most white administrators, faculty, staff, and students that the campus is a white place in which blacks and others are admitted as best as guests. So you should be happy we allowed you in here. Yeah? Thank you, Master. This white ecology, bolstered by attitudes, traditions, and quite often by alcohol, is the reason why 25% of minority students in the nation report experiencing hate crimes in these colleges, ranging from the mild name-calling to physical violence and threats. And I believe this estimate underestimates the extent of the problem, as far too many colleges have an incentive for not gathering data on these crimes. Similar like rape on campus, yeah? That wasn't rape, it was sort of, hard sex. It's not a crime, it's sort of, a misunderstanding. I'm like, really? If it was in the street, it's a crime, yeah? But in a college, it's not. The combined effects of white symbols, of white symbols in HBCUs creates an oppressive racial ecology where just walking on campus is unhealthy for minority students, staff, and faculty, yeah? Where minority students, staff, and faculty feel, as one observer commented, quote, as guests who have no history in the house they occupy. There are no photographs on the wall that reflect their image. Their paraphernalia, paintings, scents, and sounds do not appear in the house. HBCUs have statues for Lincoln, that's Wisconsin, my alma mater. A lot of the white students, when they graduated, they went on Lincoln and I never did that, yeah. There are rooms, this is Duke, there are rooms with pictures, yeah, of former presidents. And I lecture sometimes in these rooms, the president rooms, and it's all these white men, yeah. So I'm like, oh, this is like the Klan room. I move quickly. And in some places, they have statues of Venus, yeah? It took a little bit for you to realize, yeah? And building after building named after white folks. But where are the statues or buildings honoring Native Americans, Black, and Latino leaders? Where are the buildings named after important minority educators or leaders? Where are the symbols making these campuses multicultural environments? This is one reason why we feel like guests who have no history in the house we occupy. I now conclude by first recapping what I just said. First, I argue that racism is systemic, and therefore the problem of racism is not the racist, but the system structured around race. Second, I suggested that systemic racism did not end in the 1960s, but became a more sophisticated, now you see it, now you don't, system that I labeled the new racism. Third, I stated that the new racial ideology is in town. I call it Colorblind Racism, now the mystery of the smiling monster, yeah? Which supports the new racism and is a more formidable foe as it is slippery and seemingly non-racial. Lastly, I argue that most colleges and universities, including Harvey Mudd, are HBCUs and as such reflect and reproduce whiteness. Now I'm going to connect everything to STEM fields somehow. You can do it. Okay. People in STEM fields must think seriously about all these matters if they want their diversity efforts not to be mere window dressing. It is not enough to have a few programs for minority students, a few fellowships, a diversity office, and a multicultural center. We need those things, so don't be dropping them. But it's not enough. Yeah? Yeah. Feel for you, yeah. Okay. So you at Harvey Mudd College, like in all HBCUs across the nation, must appreciate that the problem of racism, which is at the core of the diversity dilemma, is systemic rather than a matter of a few prejudiced students, staff, and faculty. The new thinking on diversity must be rooted on this social fact. And accordingly, this college must understand that until it becomes a truly multicultural college, diversity efforts will accomplish precious little. But let me be clear, I'm not suggesting that since racism is a national problem, that universities cannot do anything until the nation changes. On the contrary, because of the unique role of universities as institutions of knowledge production, as places willing to experiment, and as potential repositories of what is good in society, they can and should struggle to forge spaces where racial democracy and racial justice flourish. HBCUs, like Harvey Mudd, can enact non-reformist racial reforms with the goal of eliminating their white foundation and structure and fostering their transformation into a truly inclusive, democratic institution of higher learning. The work will be hard, but HBCUs can reimagine and reinvent themselves into pockets of anti-racism and true universalism in America. When HBCUs do that, then they will truly become just colleges and universities, and minority representation in the STEM fields, or in any field for that matter, will no longer be a big issue. Thank you.